Welcome back to Pakistani Writings in English. Today I'll be speaking about another important topic. If you look at my previous two discussions, I've talked about literary production in Pakistan and then the issue of representation of Pakistan as a society in Pakistani English literature. Today I'll take the discussion one step forward and deal with a very important topic, that is native reception of representation of Pakistan in diasporic writers' works. The basic idea of today's discussion is native readers express their discomfort about the reliability of representation of Pakistan in the works of these writers who are significantly not currently living in the country. So their diasporic status, their settlement in a foreign country, convinces these readers to question the trustworthiness and comprehensiveness of their narrative on Pakistan. So it is quite evident for any reader of Pakistani English literature that the major Pakistani writers who are internationally recognized as representative, critically acclaimed Pakistani writers are diaspora. So here I would like to define diaspora in two ways. The first is a brief definition which says diaspora means displaced persons and communities moving across the globe. And the second and slightly detailed definition is dispersed population across more than one territory, having a durable and salient relationship to a common origin, identity, or homeland. Now, keeping these two definitions in mind, let me talk about the sentiment of native readers about representation of the country by these diasporic writers, and then how these definitions allow us to see a flaw in their argument. When the native readers express their doubts as to the reliability and acceptability of portrayal of Pakistan by these diasporic writers on the grounds that these writers are not currently living in the country, it suggests they think these writers are, one, displaced from the country, second, their representation of Pakistan is not accurate due to the distance that is there between the writers and their homeland. So this displacement of these writers from their native land is enough to make their portrayal of the native society dubious and unreliable. On the other hand, if you look at the two definitions of diaspora I have offered here, The first definition simply talks about displacement of people from one place. They leave their place of origin and settle in another land. But the second definition brings in another aspect to this experience of diaspora, and that is very important. The second definition, apart from highlighting their displacement, also incorporates the fact that despite this displacement, diaspora still maintain a strong relationship and affiliation to their first culture. Now, these two definitions allow us to see that the assumption of the native readers that displacement means disconnection is wrong. Although these writers are not currently living in the country, but they still carry and hold a very strong and undeniably socially and politically strong link and connection to their place of origin. And this strong relationship to their homeland, to their native culture, empowers them, offers them the license to talk about it. So one thing that becomes obvious here is that displacement does not imply disconnection, especially in terms of culture and identity. Simply speaking, since these diasporic writers still hold cultural and identity relationship with their first culture, they are allowed, they have the right to talk about it and explore their own society in their narratives. So here we are actually dealing with two things: cultural hybridity of these writers and the creative art, how they use their art to portray their own native culture. Now, what is interesting here is a very difficult position that these diasporic writers hold in the literary scenario. For Western readership, they are recognized as representatives of the native culture, and hence their version of native culture is authentic and reliable for them. At the same time, these diasporic writers, due to their in-between status, they are from the native culture but settled in a foreign culture, and their identity is somehow in between the two. The very idea that is given and explained by Homi Bhabha in his introduction to the book Location of Culture, which is edited by him. So these hybrid writers who are creating works of literature have a difficult experience managing a balance between two sides. On the one hand, they have Western readership with their own expectations, considering them representatives of the natives. On the other hand, we have the native readership who doubt the reliability of their narratives only because they're displaced from the native culture. Now, these writers, in a way, are intermediaries between the East and the West, between the native culture and the host culture, accommodating a kind of dialogue between the two. So, what we have to understand here is how far the reservations of native readership are well grounded. So, here I have categorized the factors which can potentially affect the narrative by these diasporic writers in two categories. First is socioeconomic factors, and second is personal factors, and I'll talk at length about both. Now, socioeconomic factors means those aspects of Western civilization to which these writers have exposure, which somehow affect their narrative and writing due to their exposure to a different culture. So the first factor is political domination of the Western civilization and its influence on the writers and their characters. Due to this experience living in another culture and finding themselves politically dominated by the Western civilization, the writers, and as I'll give you examples from works of fiction, their characters seem to acknowledge the political superiority of the Western civilization. And this experience and this realization can certainly affect these diasporic writers' representation of the native culture. I'll explain this point a bit later. One thing that you must notice here is, and this is the idea of extra authorial imperative explained by a post-colonial scholar, Ijaz Ahmed, in his book In Theory, and it is also included in Dr. Masood Ashraf Raja's article Pakistani English Novel. This is an article which I have referred to quite a few times in my previous discussions too. Extra authorial imperative means those factors which affect the writer from outside his art. This is something that the writer, as a writer, is not supposed to observe and follow. But these extra authorial imperatives these extraneous factors do play their role in affecting the writer's multiple choices while creating the narrative. So here the extra authorial imperative is the appropriation of third world literature by the Western market. The market demands a certain kind of literature, a certain kind of representation of third world countries by their own writers, and the writings that fulfill certain implicit expectations and demands of the market sell better than others. So this commercialization of writing coming from third world countries does affect the writer's creation of a certain narrative. Obviously, he understands the market dynamics. What kind of narrative will sell better? So here we can see that socioeconomic factors, political domination of the West, and these market demands can be interpreted as having a certain impact on the construction of narratives talking about the third world countries. The next point I want to include here is even more interesting. Instead of looking at the political domination of the Western civilization or market demands on third world literature, I believe the cosmopolitan experience of these writers and their characters by extension actually alters their sensibilities, their very outlook on life. Now, one thing that I did not explain in the beginning while talking about the native readers' reservations about trustworthiness and reliability of representation of Pakistan by these diasporic writers is the fact that these writers are not only immigrants living in a different foreign culture, but at the same time they have got education from the West, which means this education, this foreign education, must have played a role to shape their vision, their approach towards life. See, education does have certain local and international aims. That is why in post-colonial societies we have scholars and critics advocating the use of native language as a medium of teaching, and also teaching native literature to children from a certain culture so as to make them aware of their own artistic, cultural and historical achievements to feel grounded. Now, since most of these Pakistani diasporic writers have got education from the West, have lived there for a considerable amount of time. This must have affected their ideology, their outlook on life. And these living experiences, where they notice civic, socio-economic and technological advancement of the West against the East. They find a huge difference between the so-called first world countries and third world countries from which they belong. Now, some of the critics have called this approach of diasporic writers as reorientalism. By reorientalist representation, I mean portrayal of native society and its culture in comparison with the second culture, reinforcing the Orientalist discourse on the East. So this argument of reorientalism in the works of diasporic writers signifies that the literature coming from the third world countries actually strengthens the very tropes and characteristics which were associated with the East in Orientalist discourse. So instead of challenging some of the biased and partial representations of the East, these writers originally from the third world countries actually substantiate and strengthen those. Now, my point here is, as I have mentioned in Change of Sensibilities, the very title of this slide, that this is not somehow a willful and deliberate attempt on the part of these diasporic writers to somehow vilify the native culture. Rather, this representation stems from their own understanding of the difference between the East and the West and how they think West has made progress and secures a superior position against the third world countries where the same social evils are still rampant. Now, here I want to include a point from Musharraf Ali Farooqi, who argues that representing one's native culture from a diasporic writer by a diasporic writer has its own problems and difficulties, and one of them is cultural and linguistic distance from the native land. These diasporic writers no doubt come from this native land, are familiar with the spirit of the culture, have a strong affiliation with it, but despite that, this is undeniable that this spatial distance leads to a kind of cultural and linguistic distance from the native country. Now they no longer have direct first hand, day to day access to various practices and linguistic expressions being used by the natives. So, when it comes to representation, language is a very important tool, and its role in representation cannot be denied. So, the writer who is representing the native culture has these problems. His knowledge of the culture and language is limited, and he is no more the immediate observer and one who experiences things on daily basis. So there has to be a certain difference between the viewpoint of a native and a diasporic writer. So these writers are actually writing from a migrant position. They are seeing things from the perspective of a migrant. That is why we have many writers talking about the problems that immigrants have faced and are facing in different countries. So their position is different from that of a native observer and writer, which is more intimate, more immediate. So this problem needs to be acknowledged and realized. Here I just want to quote a section from his interview with Mushtaq Bilal, published in Mushtaq Bilal's book Writing Pakistan, that is a compilation of his interviews with different seminal Pakistani writers. Mushtaq Bilal asks him this question: most of the Pakistani writers who produce English fiction have either lived or studied abroad in countries like the USA, the UK, Canada. How does the experience of living as an immigrant impact one's literary and cultural sensibilities? A very pertinent question, exactly reflecting our major argument in this discussion. Native readers' reservations about the representation of their country by these diasporic writers. So let's look at how Musharraf Ali Farooqi responds. He says, "My sensibilities have not changed as a result of living in Canada. It is quite different when you are not living in your own society and are writing about it from the outside. When you are living in your own society, you notice certain things like the subtleties of our expressions, reactions, and impulses, which may seem trivial, and you can capture them in your writing. But if you are living abroad, you are cut off from these things and you can't imagine these things easily either." Remember, in the very beginning, I mentioned how these writers are creating their literature on their native culture. But even creative literature is not solely based on imagination. There are certain concrete materials you derive from society itself, society that you live in, that you experience, that you explore through your writings. So Musharraf Ali Farooqi's viewpoint here seems very balanced, although, as I'll explain later, we are not asking these writers to stop writing about the native culture, but at least as mature readers, we do recognize the problems that must be found in the representation of the native culture by diasporic writers. And one problem is, pointed out by Musharraf Ali Farooqi here: cultural and linguistic distance from the native culture. Let me here give you an example from Mohsin Hamid's The Reluctant Fundamentalist, and what I mean by change in sensibility. When Changiz comes back to Pakistan after 9/11 in the story, he experiences a certain untoward change in his perception towards his surroundings, his house, family, and by extension, let's say, his way of living, his culture. So he finds that his house is smacking of lowliness, since he has lived in West, in USA, for a considerable amount of time. Now he is unwittingly, psychologically, unconsciously seeing things in comparison, and finds his house lowly in comparison with his experiences in USA. And then he comments on this realization himself, saying, "I was disturbed by what this implied about myself." This means realization of a certain strange change that had taken place in his perception. I was disturbed by what this implied about myself, that I was a man lacking in substance, and hence easily influenced by even a short sojourn in the company of others. So this temporary visit to an advanced society brings a certain change in him. It somehow makes him feel inferior about his own surroundings, his own culture. And this is the kind of sensibility I have explained in the beginning, that due to the change in sensibility, the writer's representation of the native culture might have been affected. So if we want to sum up this discussion we have had so far, I can say that since professional writing works as a marketable commodity, the writer knows the book is to be sold in the market and he has to make a living out of it. This has its own impact on his construction of a narrative. At the same time, this demand of insider's view of the third world countries and the way these narratives from within third world countries are manipulated by the market in a very subtle way. And this point, how market works, might be a little confusing to you at this moment, but once we start talking about the role of media and how it is manipulated by the state and business sections, you'll realize how actually writing itself can be affected by these forces of commercialization. And then certainly the point I made about change of sensibilities. But in order to conclude this discussion, I want to add one very important point, and that is the autonomy of the artist to create a work of art. Despite all these factors we have outlined and explained, we cannot deny the writer to create a work of art in accordance with his own understanding and viewpoint. He has the artistic license to create a work of art according to what he deems fit. And sometimes this representation, especially in the context we are dealing with, can be contested by the native readers. So the balanced approach is that the writer has the freedom to create and represent a certain society, and the reader has the right to contest this representation. So we can conclude this discussion saying that these writers' Pakistani legacy with a transnational identity has given them a realistic and cosmopolitan understanding with which they are tempering their narratives. So these cosmopolitan experiences of these diasporic writers can be seen to have widened their arc of vision, to have matured their understanding of things. Instead of looking at them as people who are, to a great extent influenced by their exposure to the West and controlled by the market demands, we must acknowledge their freedom of creation of art, and at the same time their own vision to play a certain role in the construction of a certain kind of representation of the native society. The last point with which I believe this discussion will be complete, allowing you to see and understand the approach of these contemporary Pakistani writers better, is the concept of ParaColonialism introduced by a Pakistani scholar, Usman Salim, in his PhD thesis. While talking about these contemporary Pakistani writers like Mohsin Hamid, Kamila Shamsi, he argues that the approach that these writers have adopted in their literature can be theorized as paracolonialism, by which he means that instead of focusing on the past historical experiences of colonization and blaming the imperial powers for all the evils still found and rampant in third world countries, especially in Pakistan in our context, these writers have moved forward and focused on the contemporary issues inflicting and crippling this society. In other words, these writers have ignored the legacy and aftermath of colonial rule for the socio-economic and political crisis of third world countries. Instead of blaming the imperial powers for the chaos, disorder, and political and social problems that Pakistan is uh, going through. They situate their narratives in a post independence Pakistan, exposing the failure of both the political and military rulers in handling the affairs of the country. So they adopt this approach to make uh, the citizens realize of more immediate problems instead of simply associating their predicament and their problems to their colonial past. So these writers argue that the political and military elites have been inefficient and ineligible to play their role to improve the conditions of society. So these issues need to be addressed through these writings instead of simply talking about how the third world countries or Pakistan and India were exploited by the colonial masters. So in brief, I can say that the native readers' reservations do have uh, some convincing power, but at the same time, the discussion is the issue is very complex and needs to be understood with all its complexity. That is why I have tried to create a balance while analyzing this issue of reception of representation of Pakistan by these diasporic writers. So this is what I have to say on this. I hope once you go through this discussion, you will be able to understand things, and afterwards you will read things on your own and share your ideas or your questions if you have any with me. Thank you very much.